Hi everybody, Jonathan Fields. My guest today is Dan Ariely. Dan is a best-selling author and James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics at Duke University, with appointments at the Fuqua School of Business, the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, the Medical School, and the Department of Economics. His work has been featured widely in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and many other fancy places all over the place. And he's the author of a couple of books that I have been fascinated by. He's got an incredible personal story that we're going to explore to a certain extent, and then jump into his latest work and talk about honesty and dishonesty and sort of unwind some mythology around it. So Dan, great to be here with you today.
Thank you.
You have a fascinating personal story that I wanted to explore with you. Also in part because it seems like a lot of your professional path has been an outgrowth of things that happened to you earlier in life. So if we could sort of circle back to the earlier experiences that sort of led to your exploration of how humans explore the world.
Yeah. So as you can tell, I was badly burned when I was in my late teenage years, and I got burned in 70% of my body, from here down and from here up. And I spent about 3 years in hospital. And hospital is a place that provides lots of opportunities for observing irrational behaviors, and there were quite a few that were of particular interest to me. So in the early days in the burn department, my main concern in life was how they're going to take my bandages off. So the worst thing that happens to every burn patient is what's called the bath treatment. Every day they would come with a little forklift and lift me up and take me to this room and kind of sink me into a bath with iodine water and let me soak a little bit in there and then try to take the bandages off. Now,
how old were you, by the way?
I was 18. And if you think about it, imagine that everything is burned, which means that there's no skin. So the bandages basically adhere to the flesh, and the kind of any bleeding that happens just kind of adheres it. And so the water helps a little bit, but then they have to take the bandages off, and it can be looped 3 or 4 times around everything, and tearing it off is incredibly painful. And not only is it painful, you can hear the screams of the other patients before and after. The screaming after is not as bad. The screaming you hear before is much more terrifying. And that started me thinking about what was the right way to take bandages off. So I really wanted to take the bandages off myself, and there's lots of research on control, but I couldn't. My hands were just not as good. At that point, I couldn't move anything. But I asked the nurses to take it off slowly, to rip it off more slowly, and they told me that this was the wrong approach. And my first research project when I left the hospital and started studying in the university was, what's the best way to take bandages off? What's the best way to think about how you distribute pain over time? Right. Another thing I became very interested in are placebos for pain. So we had the budget of how much morphine we could get every day. We had a certain amount of morphine, and we could decide, each patient could decide when they want morphine and when not, and how to allocate that amount. And sometimes at night I would hear other patients scream, and they would go and give them morphine. And I not only controlled my sense of how much morphine I was getting, I also kind of tried to take stock of what other people were getting.
So even in the hospital, it's like the research brain is kicking in, trying to say, what's the process that's bigger than this?
What's going on? And sometimes they would give somebody at night some morphine, and I would call the nurse and I say, I know you just gave him too much. Can't I get some extra? And many times they said that they gave them saline. They gave them placebo,
really?
Right? And it's one thing to hear about placebos. Right. It's a completely different thing to know that somebody in the next room is suffering the same pain that you have, and then they're getting an injection with nothing, right? Salt water, and they go to sleep. And that got me incredibly interested in that aspect. And later on, I've done all kind of research about placebos and how they work. And it turns out they really work. When you get an injection, your brain secretes an opioid, very much like morphine, that actually change our pain perception. Right. So there were plenty of things to observe. And I think, like lots of things in life, sometimes when you go to the extreme and you observe something, it's just more clear. And then you can try to generalize. So my research is mostly not about people who are experiencing extreme pain, but but it is about thinking about what's a pattern of pain or pleasure that creates the most happiness or the least misery. And how do placebos work? And how do expectation change the experience? And once you get into a situation that has kind of these very high intensities, it's easier to observe and then try to study them in other areas of life. And you know, it's incredibly sad, but also interesting that hospital gave me so many experiences to draw on that are keep on fueling my research life.
Yeah, and I mean, I imagine it would also change your perspective on just having gone through it on a personal level and understanding the psychology behind it, not just from an experimenter looking in and running the experience, but having been the subject on the deepest, most visceral level.
So I think both of those are right. So one is that, you know, if you thought about how happy you are on a scale from 1 to 10, right? We all have what we think is 1 and what we think is 10.
Right.
My 1 is just much worse than most
Right.
people, thankfully, right? I don't wish this on anybody. And I think because it is burned and because I keep on seeing them on myself and because I still have some pain, nothing like I used to have, but I still have some pain, it helps me remember that 1. So because I remember how bad life can be, I can take small happiness and think of it as higher happiness, and I also don't get really upset with little bad things that happen to me.
Which is interesting too, because I was recently having a conversation with people about in the world of health. You know, one of the biggest challenges is we all know that, you know, preventative maintenance is one of the biggest things that you can do to be happier, healthier, enjoy life more, but it's nearly impossible for anyone to do it. People will respond afterwards, but what's even more fascinating to me is that, you know, if somebody has a cardiac incident, very often they'll go through a full cardiac rehab, but then 6 months out, a year out, compliance with that behavior evaporates. And what's kind of fascinating about what you just said is you have this visual reminder. And so because I always wonder, you know, what happens, how can we recreate the experience or a regular reminder in people after the initial pain of the incident has gone so that the compliance level stays high?
Yeah, so I think there's some things that are going to be better candidates for that, stuff that you have reminders of.
Right.
And there are some things that force people to a particular routine. And when there's a routine that is forced on you, there's no problem. Like think about pump inhibitors, people who get these medications for stomach acidity. No compliance problem, right? I mean, the problem with compliance is for things we don't feel on a daily level, that we don't feel the positive side, and we do feel the negative side, and then compliance goes down dramatically. Actually, for me, the biggest issue with compliance, when I was in hospital, I got a bad blood transfusion with the liver disease. And it kind of was really terrible to get it.
So layering on top of everything else.
That's right, on top of everything else. Month 2 in the hospital, I get this liver disease, and you know the first thing that happened is the transplants are rejected, then the disease subsides, then there's another operation, it flares up again. I mean, it was really a mess. About 10 years after I was originally injured, I was out of hospital, I was in grad school, I had another inflammation, another flare-up. I went to the hospital and they told me I had hepatitis C. By that time they could identify the virus. And they offered me to join this FDA protocol to try and see whether a medication called interferon that was originally approved for hereditary leukemia was going to work for this. And each of those injections was pure misery for about 12, 13 hours. Each time I injected myself, I was vomiting, headache, sick for about 12, 13 hours. And this for me was kind of the most intense self-control problem, right? In principle, if I would take these medications for a year and a half, 3 times a week, I might not die from liver cirrhosis, but for sure I would have this incredibly miserable night. And again, I think it's
and at that time, it was just a trial, so they didn't actually know.
They didn't know it was.
So there's a risk in there.
That's right. And even if they know, it doesn't help everybody, right? It's just probabilistic. But this again, I think was kind of an extreme case, right? It's a bit more intense than exercising or eating well. And it was an incredibly interesting case to try and think about how do I control it? What do people do? What do you do when you have to do this miserable thing for a long time? In my particular case, I basically used the principle we call reward substitution. And reward substitution is the idea that we are not designed to care about long-term goals, right? liver in 30 years, global warming, whatever. But maybe we can create a short-term goal that we would work toward, and through that behave as if we care about the long-term goal. So in my particular case, I did a deal with myself that says that every time I take the injection, I watch movies. Right? So I basically kind of had this substitution. I didn't take myself the injection not to die in 30 years later. I took the injection to watch movies, and that kept me going on. And I think it's actually true for many of those self-control problems. Right? You talk about anything, you say it's really difficult to be motivated about the long term. But maybe what we can do is re-engineer the environment so we have things that are short-term rewards, and they can be much smaller and more effective because they're immediate.
So what's interesting too is I recently was having a conversation with Charles Duhigg, who had this big exploration of habit, and we were talking about what he sort of described as, I guess it's sort of the classic stimulus loop applied to habit. There's the trigger or the stimulus, the behavior, and the reward. So what you're talking about to a certain extent is also manipulating that.
That's right. If there's something we call choice architecture. And choice architecture is the idea that we feel that we make decisions, we feel we're in control, we feel we're driving, but the reality is that the environment decides for us a lot of what we're going to decide.
Which we don't like to admit.
No, it's very hard to admit. So the nicest example for this comes from a research paper that examines percentage of people who donate their organs in different countries. And basically, if you look at Europe, there are countries that basically everybody donates, and countries that about 20% donate.
What's the U.S., by the way?
I don't remember what's the U.S. We're not very high.
I'm betting it's down, yeah.
It's not very high. But I'm not remember if it's in the single digits or like 10 or 20s, but it's not high. But in Europe, you have these countries that basically virtually everybody gives, and countries that 20% give. And when you look at the differences between them, it's not culture, it's not friendliness, it's not religion, it's how the form looks like. And the basic story is that if the form is what's called an opt-in form, that says check the box below if you want to participate, people don't check and don't join. If it says check the box below if you don't want to participate, people do the same thing, they don't check but now they join. And this difference in the form basically creates this tremendous difference in participation. Now if you think about it, what it means is that the person who designed the form has more to do with whether you would donate your organ than your own preferences, right? And the thing is, it's really hard to observe, right? Imagine that I send you to the DMV tomorrow, and you got an opt-in form or you got an opt-out form, and imagine you behave just like expected. Opt-in you would not, opt-out you would, and then you would come out and I say, Jonathan, why did you decide what you decided? There is no way that you're going to say that form, I did it because of the default in the form. You'll come up with stories.
Of course.
Fantastic stories, interesting stories.
Stories
I
felt it was my duty.
That's right. It was my duty. I'm a good, kind human being. It's dangerous. I mean, you'll come up with lots of stories to justify
so we'll rationalize it.
Whatever you would do. But that's an incredible principle that the environment in which we're being placed actually has a lot to do with how we decide. And then on top of that, that we're unaware of that. So think, for example, refrigerators. Right? It's an environment. Somebody designed them. Do you have sometimes rotting fruits and vegetables in the bottom drawer? Right?
I've heard of other people, but of course not me.
Right. Now, if you think about it, it's a really bad placement, right? We take the food that we should probably spend
and we put it away, so we don't
put it away in an opaque, right, where it should be front and center, so that it comes to mind first, right? It's a really small element. There's a beautiful research that shows that if you, by the water fountain, if you have the styrofoam cup first and the ceramic cups before that, people take the styrofoam. You switch them, people take the ceramic. I mean, reaching another 6 inches turns out to be a big deal because we're not thinking very carefully. We're not saying, oh, let me think about it, styrofoam, ceramic. We do whatever simplest, doing something else. And because of that, the environment really matters a great deal. And the nice thing is that we can actually be active in it. So sometimes it's other people designing our environment, like refrigerators. But sometimes we can think about our own environment and how we restructure it to get ourselves to have a better outcome.
Which is amazing also because we don't like to think that a designer at a company, 50 years ago is determining the behavior that we have today.
Yes.
It's just, it's a foreign notion to us. But my bet is that, and I'm sure you spent a lot of time doing this, if I started looking at every interaction throughout the course of a day and then a week for me, that so much of my choices or lack of choices are were made sort of unconsciously by some designer decades ago.
That's right. I think one of the saddest example, everybody knows this, is the keyboard. Right? So the keyboard was designed the way it's now to slow typing down. It was designed at a time when there were mechanical.
Right. So you didn't want the keys to get.
You
jammed.
didn't want to get the keys to. So it was designed to slow people down. Right? Now we don't need that anymore for quite a few years. Right? There's no reason to slow us down, and there are better keyboards that don't slow us down.
Right.
Incredibly hard to switch into them. I mean, somebody designed it for a very different purpose, and we're kind of stuck with it, right? And we don't realize the issues.
Yeah, I mean, it really is incredible how much of our life operates on that level. And like you said, we don't want to own that because we want to feel like we're autonomous beings that make choices. And with your last book, and your last two books, really about rationality and rationality. We want to feel like we're rational beings who are in control of our futures. And the truth is, a huge part of it just does not happen that way.
Yeah. And I also think that some of it is justifiable, right? Some of it is we're busy people, we have our own things. I mean, we don't each want to become experts in banking and mortgages and phones. And I mean, every decision is becoming so much more complex, right? Now you want to figure out what's the right phone to get. I mean, there's so many different attributes. You can't possibly become an expert in everything. But the truth is that as life becomes more complex, our ability to make good decisions is lower, and because of that, we rely to a higher degree on heuristics, on the environment, on other things as shortcuts, and therefore we're even more susceptible than we used to be. There's a very sad analysis that looked at why people die and what is the percentage of human mortality that is caused by bad decision making. And they looked at what happened about 100 years ago and what percentage of human mortality was caused by bad decision making. It's about 10%. And they look at it these days and they thought it was more than 40%. Why? How come? Well, what happened is that over the last 100 years, we designed lots of new technologies. Many of them good. Some of them can kill us. Obesity, diabetes, texting and driving, smoking. Right? So as we design those things, we're creating tremendous pressure on our decision making. I mean, think about the donut, right? In principle, a good invention. You take sugar and fat, you put it in a small container, right? If you could add some vitamins and distribute it widely in Africa, maybe it would be great. But not only do we have donuts, we have lots of them.
Right.
So now we take something that is a technological innovation, right, in some ways, and we make it such that it's incredibly tempting. And not only is it incredibly tempting now, it would only get more tempting in the future.
Right. And we have whole sciences built around, millions and millions of dollars spent around how do we make it in the nth degree more irresistible.
That's right. Because the commercial world around us, almost all of it wants us to spend time and money now. Right? Think about it. Who wants you to delay gratification? Maybe financial saving and preventative health.
Right.
But both of them, I mean, they're both of them. One of them doesn't exist. One of them is small. And the other issue is that they are not as apparent in our lives. The things that are apparent in our lives are credit cards and stores and all kinds of other things, and Facebook that wants our time and attention right now.
Yeah, and it's, when we look at what happened in the economy in the last 4 years also, it's just this focus on everything. It's just, we seem, and I guess the marketing world, the business world knows that we're sort of soft-wired to focus all of our energies on here and now, even though, but what's fascinating to me is that when, the financial world, for example, huge amount of time and energy spent into, hey, let's talk about planning, let's talk about planning, let's talk about planning. And a lot of money that goes into setting up things in the future. But, it almost is in conflict with, a far greater part of that world which operates on a very, very, sometimes, in the trading world, on a split-second basis.
Yeah. So, I mean, the financial world has lots of worlds, right? And they are very different, and they don't share the same logic and so on. But financial planning, I think, is actually an incredibly important field that is right now completely in the wrong direction. So, I think it used to be the case that a financial planner could charge you some money for optimizing your portfolio and balancing, stocks and bonds and so on. And it was okay at that time to charge you maybe 1% of asset under management for that. I think those days are gone. I think it's hard to imagine that today balancing a portfolio is worth that amount of money. So I think most of the financial planners are really getting paid way too much for doing way too little, because it's easy to do these days.
Right.
Now, you can argue a little bit better, but generally. What I think is incredibly hard for people to do is to reason about how to spend money. So what financial planners do is they take the money that you give them and they optimize that.
Right.
That's small potatoes. I think the real issue is to help people figure out how to trade off money between now and later. Money is all about trade-offs. Every time you buy something, you just bought my next book, every time you buy something, you're not going to be able to do something else. What are these trade-offs that you're making? How do we help you reason about them? Think about something like a house. We did a study when we got hundreds of people who were looking for houses to come and do searches in our lab. And you know what they do is they get the maximum amount that they can borrow, they put it in, and they look at houses in these prices and a little bit above.
Right.
The reality is that housing is not an investment. It's an investment too, but it's also where you live.
Right.
And what you need to ask yourself is, if I get a 2-bedroom versus 3-bedroom, how much money am I saving and what could I do with that money? Would it provide for me a better retirement? Could I go for extra 3 weeks a year vacation? If I get a parking spot, not. What are the trade-offs that we're making? But these trade-offs are incredibly complex, and we can't possibly expect that anybody would be an expert in making all these trade-offs. How many houses do you buy in your lifetime? So I think what financial advisors need to do is to become experts in the psychology of money. They need to be experts in thinking about how you trade off things. And rather than optimizing a portfolio and getting 0.25% more, maybe they could get you to spend money in a more efficient way, or to spend 10% less.
Right. And I guess there is a whole there are some people that focus more on doing that, but I think
it's incredibly rare. So a few weeks ago, I met a very successful financial advisor. And we sat together at dinner, and I asked him how much does he think he could benefit his clients by spending another 2 hours a week optimizing their portfolio versus spending 2 hours a week talking to them about how much they're spending compared to how much they're saving.
Yeah.
And he said there's no question that he could give tremendously more benefit in the second scenario when we would talk to him, but he said he's just not interested.
Why?
Right?
Why?
He said he's not in that business, right? He's not. I mean, and what he tells me, he's not really interested in the welfare, right? He basically found a really good way to make money is to take their money and
because that requires also. I mean, I think part of it also is that there's so much of the optimization these days is automated that there's not a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of the research is handed down, and
That's right.
and it's like tweaking. Whereas that's real work.
That's right.
I mean, that
you
is
really
real
have to
effort.
talk to everybody. You have to
Right.
understand their preferences. You have to understand what's important to them. It also feels more like clinical psychology, I think, that you go to a therapist than somebody who's numerically quantified, right? And they can think carefully about numbers and know something that you don't know. I think it would be.
It's almost like it's two different people.
Yeah. There's a funny story that when Black & Decker bought the small appliances division from GE, all of a sudden they had Black & Decker logos on popcorn makers and dust busters and all kinds of things like that. And all of a sudden handyman felt embarrassed coming with a Black & Decker drill because you came to somebody's house and
Right.
they had a vacuum cleaner that was
with
the same
Black &
brand.
Decker,
It
right.
didn't feel good. And what they did was they created a new brand called DeWalt. That was this yellow. And
So that's where DeWalt came out.
That
of?
was DeWalt came
which
out.
is sort of like the professional level brand.
It's actually the same one.
That's
it's the
too
same
funny.
drill. It's just covered in yellow and it looked
Right.
different. But they basically could not overcome the embarrassment factor of people feeling that it's the same brand as the coffee maker, right? It just didn't feel right. And I think financial advisors have a similar problem, is that they have the halo of finance behind them and kind of dealing with what makes you happy and whether you might get them to the rate of
Completely.
psychologist rather than the rate of financial advisor.
Right. No, it's a really interesting observation. The conversation also brings up a word for me, and which ties into all of your different levels of work, which is legacy, and how we make decisions about because we're talking about sacrifice here, and like what we're willing to give up to get this, and on one level you can see, okay, I'm willing to give up this to get this later in my life.
Yeah.
But what's even more interesting to me is I'm willing to give up this to leave a legacy that I won't be here to directly benefit from.
And I think in some sense it's incredibly important, but when we go on our day-to-day, it's incredibly out of mind. So we love our kids and we invest in them, and it is our legacy. And I teach for a living, and I think about my students as kind of taking the ideas and lessons, and hopefully I taught them something useful, and there's a continuation. But I think most of the things we do have this theme, or many things we do have this theme, but it's not as if this is actually the motivator. It's too far in the future. Right? I mean, it's a little bit like global warming, right? It's way too far in the future. It's really hard to care about it. If I taught the students and they were just sitting there with completely blank faces, with no feedback and no question and no immediate reward,
that wouldn't be fun.
Right? I mean, maybe I could have 3 times more students, but they couldn't do it. So we do need the immediate gratification to do things that we care about in the long term. But it's incredibly hard. Actually, you look at the financial crisis. One of the big lessons is that a quarter is not the right unit of measurement to do for financial reasoning. I mean, the fact is, now we for quite a few years, we're getting this report on the stocks daily, right? In the news, as if this is news, right? This is random fluctuation. I mean, why?
I mean, I know people that just have the screen running all day long and just the tickers going all day long.
And if you're in that business, maybe, but it's I don't know what, 95% noise, 5% signal, maybe. This should not be news. Quarterly earning. I mean, why have we picked quarters? Is this the right time frame to focus on, right? I mean, ideally, we would not do it this frequently. We have kind of a phrase saying, you are what you measure. Is at the moment you start measuring something, people start focusing on that. Right? And if you measure daily earnings, people would focus on that. You make quarterly, they'll focus on that. You measure 5-year earning, people would focus on that. Whatever you start measuring, you have the potential of making that the focus of attention. Frequent flyer miles, right? Have you ever flown some crazy route to get a bit
miles,
more? Right? Ideally, you want to maximize happiness, not frequent flyer miles. But happiness is hard to measure. Frequent flyer miles are easy, and you see it in the statement. So sometimes we optimize the wrong thing just because it's easily measurable, and we get kind of a yardstick and a feedback.
And I guess that's what you were saying. In the last couple of years, I guess one of the big pushbacks on that whole thing has been that there's been so much focus on optimizing for the quarter that which is very often is not in the best long-term interest of the clients, of the company, of anybody other than the person who's trying to optimize for a commission. Yeah,
and I also think there's lots of negative talks on CEOs, and I'm contributing to that too. So, but I think this is one case where people are not giving CEOs enough credit. So there's a discussion of changing the rewards from the CEO from being from a quarter to 5 years or 10 years. But this basically says that they're only trying to maximize their own profit and they're not really thinking about the company.
Yeah, and I don't believe that to be true either.
I don't think it's true, but I think that if I were a CEO and if every day my stock was doing badly, somebody would call me up upset. It could be a neighbor, it could be parents of my kids, right? It could be a reporter. Every day somebody would call me, and every day the stocks went up, somebody would call me and be happy with me. Right? That, I think, is much more rewarding and important and is going to drive behavior than if you change the rewards from a quarter to 5 years. Changing the stock options from a quarter to 5 years basically means that the CEOs don't care about any other voices and they're just trying to optimize their money.
Right,
I don't think so.
No, I completely agree.
I think they try to please everybody. And if you walk into a company and everybody's face is sad because they know that their value of their finance has just gone down because your stock went down by 3%, you're going to try and cheer everybody up.
So let's kind of move into, I want to explore your most recent work. You have a new book out now. Beautiful cover.
I think so.
Called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. And it really is an evolution of what we've just been talking about in your prior work. Tell me a little bit about what got you started on this exploration.
So it really all for me started with Enron. Actually, lots of things in my life start with some observation of the real world. And in this case, it was Enron, and the question was, what's a better description of Enron 3 bad apples who planned and executed a fiasco? Or is it better to describe what lots of people with wishful blindness? And I couldn't go back and study Enron, so I've been doing experiments with lots and lots and lots of people. And what I find is that there are a few bad apples, but they're incredibly few. And there's lots of slightly bad apples, but there are many of them. And just kind of to give you an example, we ran about 30,000 people in the experiments that I describe here.
Right.
And there were about 12 of them, they cheated a lot, and about 18,000 who cheated a little. And I lost about $150 to the people who cheated a lot, and I lost about $35,000 to the people who cheated a little. And I think that kind of reflects the picture in society, that from time to time there are cheaters. They're out there. But what is really incredible is that many of us have the capacity to slightly change our view of reality and still feel good about ourselves. So, everybody understands this in sports. If you're a fan of a particular team, you know that every call the referee calls against your team, you'll think the referee is blind, evil, vicious, something else. And the same thing happens when you get paid, right? Conflicts of interest in sport is because you want to see things from the perspective of this team. The same thing happens if you got paid. So imagine you're a banker and you get paid $5 million a year if you can see a particular derivative as being a good product. Ask yourself whether you would not be able to truly see it as a good product. I don't mean lie to your customers. Say to your customers, you should get it, but you know that you're cheating.
Right, but you'll find a way.
You'll find a way.
Right.
And what we also find is that as things move away from money, it's easier to tell ourselves a story about this. So there's a little joke, and the joke is that little Johnny comes home from school with a note from the teacher that says that little Johnny stole a pencil from the kid who's sitting next to him. And Johnny's father is furious and says, Johnny, I'm embarrassed and humiliated. You never take a pencil from the kid who's sitting next to you. You're grounded for 3 weeks and just wait until your mother comes. And besides, Johnny, if you need a pencil, you know very well you can just say something. You can just ask and I will bring you dozens of pencils from work. And the reason this is slightly amusing is that I think we all understand that taking a pencil from work is something we view very differently than taking 10 cents from petty cash box, even if we took that money and bought a pencil. And we find these in experiments. We find that when people cheat for something else, a token that later on becomes money, cheating goes up dramatically. And this actually worries me a lot about the financial markets, right? If we can't cheat for cash, but we can cheat more for tokens, what about stocks? Stock options, derivatives. I mean, as things become more and more distant from money, and as you don't see the person that you're cheating, it becomes easier to cheat more and still feel good about yourself.
And I mean, what you just also said is, as you don't see the person. I wonder also, it's fascinating to me, and I wonder how much the interactions becoming digital and screen-based affects this also, whereas if you were standing in front of somebody, would you have a completely different reaction?
That's right. Our general approach is that we think in the economic framework of cost-benefit analysis. And we say that a person will just, if they can't be caught, they will be just evil. I don't think so. I think people are incredibly good, much better than economic theory would predict. Look, I mean, we're here now. I would probably have time by the end of the day to steal all kinds of things if I wanted to from this thing. Odds are that I'm not going to do it, not because I have a probability of being caught, but because I don't want to do it myself, right? I have an internal mechanism that I care about and my own view of my own morality and self. And that's actually what keeps us at bay. What's interesting is that mechanism that keeps us at bay is sensitive to things like how much are other people doing? What can we rationalize?
Which is a big social context. So.
Who are we taking from? Do we see the person?
Right.
There's a classical problem in philosophy called the trolley problem. And the trolley problem says you see a train coming, and if it's going to continue straight, it's going to kill 5 people. But you are by a lever, and if you pull the lever, it will go on a different track, and it would kill 1 person. 5 versus 1, what would you do? Most people say, I'll pull the lever, kill the one. There's a second version of this problem. You're standing on the bridge, and there's a guy next to you with a big backpack, and the train is going, and it's going to kill 5 people. And there's nothing else you can do, but you can push that guy. And if you push that guy, he would fall on the tracks, the train will run him over, and then it will stop. And the reason he has a backpack is you can't jump yourself. You need to be somebody with a lot of weight. Okay, would you do it? And now most people say no.
Changes it,
Especially, by the way, if the guy looks you in the eyes and you have to push him backward. Right? It's incredible. And what's interesting is that in the first component, we think 5 versus 1.
Right. It's just numbers.
It's just numbers. Yeah. In the second case, there's a person. You look them in the eyes, you understand that there's a livelihood there, and you have a really hard time taking that away. And I think it's amazing what little distance does. You don't need a lot, right? But little distance makes a big difference.
Yeah, it really is incredible. And which is, I wonder how much, as much as technology, expands our world, it flattens our world, it expands my ability to have relationships around the world. At the same time, I wonder how much humanity it's taking from us.
Yeah. Well, I think this goes back to our discussion about how do we design the world, right? And we can do whatever we want. So think about the development of the digital wallet. We will have a digital wallet. And now we can decide how to do it. We can decide if to represent opportunity cost or not, represent opportunities for donation and charity or not. The stock market, we can also. I mean, every trader can in principle see once a day the picture, like in Facebook, of the people they're trading for. Right? We could force them to be friends with them.
Right. But what if before they had to confirm a trade, that person's family picture had to come up on their screen?
It's all a question of design. I mean, there's lots of things we could do, but if we understand that distance facilitates all kinds of behaviors, with technology we can either say, let's increase the distance, or we can say, let's decrease.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Because I had looked at it as technology automatically increases distance, but maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe you can actually reverse that. Sure. Fascinating. One other thing that you talked about in this book that I thought was kind of interesting, and we've talked about environment and not just cheating, but behavior in general. But this is the idea of levers, sort of like increasing and decreasing and neutral. Talk to me just a little bit about this idea and how it plays into the idea of sort of honesty.
So there are basically kind of two starting points for the dishonesty that we find that most people can, which is rationalization and a slippery slope. And lots of things change rationalization, and some of them kind of make sense, and we experiment with each of them. So for example, when other people around you behave in this way, right? Easier to rationalize. Right. When something is multiple steps removed from money, easier to rationalize. And by the way, which people do you think find it easier to rationalize than other people? Turns out it's creative people. Why? Because here is what we try to do. We try to think of ourselves as honest and cheat a little bit. And you could say, oh, you can't do both. You can either be honest or you can cheat. Right. Well, if you can rationalize, the extent of your rationalization allows you to do both. If you're creative, you can tell better stories, right? So now you can cheat even more and tell better stories about it at the same time. So it's amazing how many different mechanisms help us rationalize. And from that perspective, the book is not just about cheating. It's really about these non-rational mechanisms that help us to behave differently than what we would want and not see that. Right. And I'll say one last thing, which is that in policy these days, there is the idea of disclosures. And disclosure is being promoted, sunshine policy is disclosure. And the idea is that if you just have to disclose something, everything will be right. And I think disclosure kind of is incorrect and belittle people, right? If you are my banker, it's about disclosure. It means that the only reason you're cheating is because you're evil. That what you want to do is cheat, but if somebody is looking at you all the time, you will not do it. But the only thing that stops you is that somebody is following you. But if you think that most of the cheating happened because of rationalization, it's not if somebody is watching you or not. You will be able to explain it to yourself. Then disclosure is going to be ineffective. Right. Because you're not doing it because of fear of being caught. You're doing it because you're able to both do it and think of yourself as a wonderful, honest, kind human being at the same time.
Which, it's interesting that there's so much focus on disclosure. I guess we'll know sort of longer term if it's really mattering.
Well, the sad thing is we will not really know because we're not comparing it to anything.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? So what we need to do is we need to be more experimental. It's actually incredible to me, right? We're implementing all these disclosure policies without implementing any way to measure their efficacies. Yeah. What we need to do is ask some banks to do disclosure, some banks to do something else, and measure things.
That would be that'd be a tough experiment to set up, at least in this country.
Yeah.
And Dan, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having the conversation. I wish you best of luck with the book again. Fantastic new book. Go out and get it. Dan goes a lot deeper into this conversation, a whole lot more about just why we do what we do, why we don't what we do, and how we explain it and rationalize and fudge things to feel okay with how we exist in the world. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.